California, the state of the West Coast, and the most populous state in America. Now let's head back to the 20th century. Some decades may not been so good, but there was one thing that was really nice back then. That's right. Airlines. There was an airlines that characterizes for a thing. Smile. Welcome to the second episode of Airlines History by Bear Aviation. Pacific Southwest Airlines, better known as PSA, was the very first budget low-cost carrier in the United States. Now let's head back to 1949. World War II had just ended, and many airlines head back to service. A plane that was vital to the Allies was the C-47, mainly known as DC-3 because it was a passenger plane converted to a military one for the D-Day. When the war was over, the DC-3 became the main airplane for many startup airlines. One of them was Pacific Southwest. They started in 1949 and started operations in San Diego's Lindbergh Field with a leased Douglas DC-3. The founder Kenneth Friedkin knew that if the prices were cheap enough, people will fly instead of take the bus or the train. So the airline opened a weekly round trip from San Diego to Oakland via Burbank. On the flight, the passengers were served coffee, peanuts, and fresh donuts from local bakeries. At that time, the weekly round trip costed just $15, which would be about $120 today. But for 1949, this was a big low fare. Due to this fact, big airlines like United or Delta started reducing prices to match PSA. Okay, now is 1950. And PSA was still a small airline. So they expanded the flight menu. But they still weren't able to catch up many big airlines with their new super ultra sci-fi technology planes, the DC-6. So in 1954, PSA introduced the DC-4 to replace and phase out the old and ugly DC-3s, but it still wasn't the newer DC-6. So what PSA did was paint squares around the windows due to the fact that the DC-4 had round windows, and the newer DC-6 had squared. This was to make the passengers think they were flying on the DC-6. But eventually PSA got their own DC-6 fleet. What time is it? Oh, it's jet time. In 1958, Douglas and Boeing introduced the Boeing 707 and the Douglas DC-8, which they were new super rare sci-fi technology, jet-powered engines. Airlines started ordering like crazy. Lockheed didn't want to get behind, so they built the Lockheed Electra, the first turbojet propeller engine. PSA, being a medium airline, ordered 15 Lockheed Electra, and they introduced the Electras in 1959. So no, PSA entered the jet age. It is 1960. And no, the world is jet. The piston planes were still flying, but they were really phased out when the jets came along. PSA was no a big airline with many destinations. So no, it was the time to buy the jets. In 1964, PSA ordered the new short and medium range routes plane, the Boeing 727. And that was their first truly jet plane. Remember the weekly round trip? Well, with the 727 the time just lasted 58 minutes. And in 1966 they introduced a very iconic, important, and special plane, the Boeing 737. And as you can see, the plane now was a smile in the livery. This was the first PSA plane to have a smile on the aircraft. The flight attendants also wore a new uniform, the so-called Californian beauties. But competition is something that every airline will face sooner or later. In 1969, PSA was competing with the airline called Air California. But I already talked about AirCal, so go check that video in the link on the description. Anyway, in 1969 the airline bought their most iconic plane, the Douglas DC-9. And with this short-range plane they were able to expand to little airports in California and Arizona. It is now 1970. And PSA now has a new livery, which is a sunset sky, I think. But the smiles were still there. And in the 70s, PSA expanded internationally with destinations in Mexico, like Los Cabos or Puerto Vallarta. And they also started service to Nevada like Reno or Las Vegas. But in 1978 there was a really tragic accident. PSA Flight 182. The Boeing 727 was departing from San Francisco to San Diego. And on takeoff the wing collided with a departing Cessna 172. And you may know what happened next. But the rest of the 70s were not too bad for PSA due to the deregulation of airlines. And that let every US airlines decide what planes they would buy, and which destinations to serve. There is nothing else than I can tell about PSA in the 1970s. OMG, it is now the 1980s. With a lot of cool 80s stuff. And PSA was now the second biggest airline in California and the West Coast. And this was because the carrier Continental had many destinations that PSA didn't serve, like Honolulu or Seattle. And in 1981 they bought two very iconic jets, the DC-10 and the MD-80. The DC-10 let to the airline no really expand to Seattle, because the DC-10 was a long-range airliner, and the MD-80 had a big runway performance. And that let to the airline expand to mid-airport cities like Orange County. But 1986 something good-bad happened. The biggest competitor of PSA, AirCal, had just been bought by American Airlines. This may sound good at first, but that meant that PSA will now be competing with a large legacy carrier, something that they wouldn't be able to handle. But that didn't matter much for PSA. Yay! It is now the 1990s. With a lot of cool 90s stuff. PSA was now the biggest regional airline in California. And they still had danger from American Airlines. But in 1991, PSA introduced their final jet, the BEA 146, and the plane made the airline expand to little domestic cities like Long Beach. Sadly, in 1992, PSA Flight 17.71 crashed because a man brought a Gram 4 in the plane and put the airplane in a dive. But for the next years PSA was a good airline, but due to the competition of American. In 1996 PSA merged with US Air, and US Air began repainting aircraft, causing them to lose their iconic smiles. PSA began shrinking and going failure. And in November of 1998, with almost 50 years of operation, PSA flew for one last time. The irony in this situation is that PSA merged with US Air to avoid a likely takeover from American or a larger airline. But in 2002 US Air merged into America West. Ho then created US Airways. And then US Airways merged into American. So in the end, PSA was sort of indirectly eaten by American, and actually PSA's legacy still lives in the roots of Southwest Airlines. PSA teaches Southwest that being cheap and fun will bring in passengers. There is still one American Airlines plane painted in the PSA Smile livery. And maybe when we see that plane again, we will remember the cheap Californian airline.